1 Corinthians 13 is often called the chapter on love, and rightfully so. I don't think there's anything wrong at all with summing up the words of 1 Corinthians 13 in just that single word, love. Let's read together this passage beginning in verse 1. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels but do not have love, I've become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but I don't have love, I'm really nothing. If I give all of my possessions to feed the poor, if I deliver my body to be burned, but I do not have love, it profits me nothing. Verse 4, love is patient, love is kind, love is not jealous, love does not brag, love is never arrogant. It does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. And in verse 8, love never fails. If there are gifts of prophecy, they'll be done away with. If there are tongues, they'll cease. If there's miraculous knowledge, it will also be done away. For now we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. When I was a child, I used to speak as a child, think as a child, reason as a child. When I became a man, I did away with childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know fully, just as I also have been fully known. But right now, before us, abide these three things: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of them is love. What I really like about this passage is it's one of those passages that puts meat on the bones of what can seem like a very vague concept. Like, if I was to ask you to define love, just give me just a standard dictionary definition of love. It's harder to do than you'd think it would be. Is love just the expression of unselfishness? Is love a romantic concept? Is love a brotherly concept? Is it just about friendship and companionship? Is love charity? Is love benevolence? Or is love all of those things? It's kind of a difficult concept to pin down. And yet the Apostle Paul rather successfully does that. In 1 Corinthians 13, he puts meat on the bones of a very vague concept. 1 Corinthians 13 is the practical chapter on love. This is what love looks like in practice. This is what love looks like on a day-to-day basis. This is what it'll look like in a marriage. This is what it'll look like between you and your neighbor. You'll even love in this way with your enemies. And so again, we rightly call this the chapter on love. But today I want to take a look at the other love chapter. Because there is another passage of Scripture in the New Testament that I point to as being one of the great Scriptures on this subject of love. And while Paul puts meat on the bones in 1 Corinthians 13 and gives us the very practical, day-to-day side of love, I think 1 John chapter 4 gives us the really high-level definition of it. Paul tells us in his passage what love looks like, what you must do to express it, what love endures, and how love is patient, while John in 1 John chapter 4 says, and this is why you do it. This is the explanation behind love, the very concept of it. Where does love come from? What is its origin? What does it really mean? Why do we love? Why not be selfish? Why bear all things? Why endure all things? Why not rejoice in unrighteousness? Because that sure seems fun sometimes. And so let's take a look at the other love chapter today. In 1 John chapter 4, let's begin in verse 7. And we'll go through the end of the chapter. And what we're going to do is take a look at some things kind of as we go, verse by verse, and make some applications as we move through this wonderful amazing, stimulating passage of Scripture. In 1 John chapter 4, beginning in verse 7. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. And everyone who loves is born of God, and everyone who loves knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, for God is love. And we'll stop there and make a point. Love is from God. This passage says that love has its ultimate origin from God. We know from the book of Genesis, as well as thousands of years of practice, that we are beings created in God's image. That whatever we are, whatever we possess, whatever emotions that we feel, at their origin, really they come from God. When we're angry, that is an imperfect expression of a perfect emotion from God. Even things like jealousy. God says He's a jealous God, right? Every one of our emotions, kind of at its core, in its perfect form, comes from God. And most of all, most importantly of all, that's true of love. Love comes from God. Even the unbeliever, when he or she practices love, is showing that glimmer, that spark, that design within his or her soul. Even if you deny everything else about God, and bury your head in the sand and pretend that God doesn't exist and tell that to yourself over and over and over again until you actually maybe kind of, at least on the surface, believe it. When you practice love, you are showing something of God in you. And that means something, by the way. To me, that gives me encouragement. Like, people are real pessimistic, aren't they? I think we tend to be very pessimistic. Like, we look at the future and we look at politics and we look at the way people treat each other. And we always feel like the next generation is going to be like the last one. It's going to destroy everything. But I think the generation before me thought that also. Like, they probably assumed my generation was just going to mess everything up. And I think the generation before them thought they were going to mess everything up. And the generation before them. And I think we tend to have this kind of pessimistic streak that runs through us. And we think that churches aren't growing and people aren't interested in the gospel. And our culture has turned away from Christian principles. If you want to feel a little bit more optimistic, look no further than love. And I don't mean to sound all like flower power, hippie child or anything like that, because I'm not. But I do mean that. When you look around and you see people still loving each other, as long as people are still loving each other, there's something we can build on there. There's something that we can use, a way that we can reach people. And as hard-hearted as they might be in every other aspect of life, when you really pin people down and get them thinking about love, love is the one thing that doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the naturalistic explanation. It doesn't fit the atheist explanation. It doesn't fit the agnostic explanation. It's the one thing, the wrench in the mechanism. When you try to pretend that there is no God and ignore Him, love is the one thing that it's the one part of the equation that's just not adding up. You know why? Because it's from God, and it can only be explained with God as part of the equation. Now notice what he goes on to say here. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, for it says, verse 8, for God is love. Now that's an odd concept, isn't it? God is love. Because there are other passages that describe Him in different ways. I also see a very angry God at times. And I see a jealous God. God is also justice. He's judgment. So does this phrase, God is love, does that sit at odds with other descriptions of God? It bothers me a little bit when we try to simplify God, when we try to put Him into a box, because we don't like it when people do that to us, right? I mean, I don't want people to put me into a box. That just because I have at times been angry, I don't want someone to define me as Ryan is anger. And just because there have been times where I have had to mete out justice with my children, I don't want my children to only define me as Dad is judge, jury, and sometimes executioner. Are we not more complicated beings than that? Can we not agree that God is more complicated than that? So this statement, God is love, does not sit at odds with God is also angry, and God is also just, and God is also merciful, and God is also jealous. Because these are all aspects of God that express themselves depending on the circumstance. But I like the way Paul put it back in 1 Corinthians 13, that of all these other great concepts, you have faith and you have hope, and there are a lot of other amazing concepts out there as well. There is trust, and there's justice, and there's mercy, and there's compassion, right? There's all these great high-level concepts out there, but the one that stands above them all is love. So whether God is angry, or God is jealous, or God is just, or God is merciful, behind all of it, God is love. Now be careful. This isn't saying that love is God. Because I think we get that mixed up sometimes, don't we? We'll say that because God is love, that also means that love is God. So I can worship love, right? And as long as I'm loving, that's all I need. Well, this phrase doesn't mean that love is God. Love is the subordinate part of that phrase. God is love, but love isn't always just God. We have a hard time defining love, for example. And anybody who wants to assert that there is not really a God, that there is no actual God, that God doesn't exist, but only that love is God, right? And as long as we just love people, then love is all we need. They fail to realize there's more than one side to God. The fact that God is love tells us that everything He does, all of His dealings with us, His commandments, even justice and judgment, proceed from love. Love is the motivator. Love is the engine that drives all of those things. I like in the Old Testament even, the commandments that God gives His people, like in the book of Deuteronomy 6 verse 24, they're good. God didn't command the Israelites to do all that stuff in the book of Deuteronomy or Leviticus or Exodus. He didn't command them to do that just because He wanted to be entertained. I know what I'll do. I'm going to command them to go through a bunch of rituals, and then I'm going to make them make a really expensive, fancy tent. And I'll just sit up there in heaven and kind of like, look at that. They're actually doing it. Jesus, look, they're doing it. I can't believe that. When God commands us to do something, it's not just because He needs to be entertained, or He's playing with us, or messing with us, or tormenting us, or manipulating us. He commands us to do things because He loves us. He also puts fences up because He loves us. Because sin is a deception. Sin is painful. Sin is harmful. Ultimately, sin destroys, and the wages of sin is death. So when God says, don't cross this boundary, it's not because He's keeping us from something better. He's not tricking us. Right? I don't know anybody who has come back. And by the way, I'm not saying this to step on anybody's toes like in particular, right? I'm not singling one person out or another. But anybody who has come back from adultery, right? When they've gone out in the wilderness of adultery and they've come back from that and repented, there is nobody who comes back from adultery and says, you know what? Tell you what, it was a lot of fun. I see now why God told us not to do that, because a lot of fun out there. He's really keeping us from something. Nobody comes back from that and says that God was keeping us from some secret fun all along. And the same is true of any sin. Nobody comes back from the brink of self-destruction and says, I don't know why God told us not to do that. I don't get it. I don't understand. I went deep into that sin and nobody ever hurt me. You know, my wingtips never got singed. Nobody comes back from sin and feels like God was just kind of like fencing off some secret fun that He's kind of keeping for Himself or something like that. God loves us. And when God says, do not do this, He means it. Because there's only pain there and self-destruction. Let's go back to our text now, 1 John chapter 4. And let's pick up here in verse 9 now. Notice verse 9 of our text. By this, the love of God was manifested in us. That's a word, we don't use that word a lot anymore, manifested. It comes to life. It's used. There's a material side to it, something tangible about that. He says here, by this the love of God was manifested in us, that God has sent His only begotten Son into the world so that we might live through Him. In this is love, verse 10. Not that we loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the propitiation for our sins. There's two words that I really like from these two verses. First of all, begotten. That word there, the only begotten Son, it means the only one of its kind. It means it's special. God didn't have extra sons to give. He didn't have sons that were expendable. He didn't send His least favorite son. He didn't send someone as a proxy. There was only one of them. His only begotten Son. Irreplaceable. So that's one word I really like, the only begotten Son. The other word I really like is propitiation. That Son served as our propitiation. Parakletos is the word there, or hilasmos, hilasmos in the Greek is the word there for propitiation. Jesus satisfied a requirement that we could never satisfy for ourselves. Paid something that we could never afford. Dealt with a debt that we could never pay off. It was just too much. We were in over our heads. During the Lord's Supper this morning, I was reading Romans chapter 5. That's one of the passages I like to go to sometimes when I'm reflecting on the sacrifice of Jesus. And in Romans chapter 5, the writer notes there a very similar idea where he says in verse 6 that while we were still helpless, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. One would hardly die for a righteous man. Perhaps for a really good man someone would dare even to die. But God demonstrates His own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more than, having now been justified by His blood, we shall be saved from the wrath of God through Him. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of His Son, much more, having now been reconciled, we shall be saved by His life. We were helpless. Helpless. Yet forgiven. What a great word there, propitiation. Now he goes on to say, let's move on to the next verse here. In verse 11, beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. Now this is introducing us now to a really big concept in 1 John chapter 4. And this is not the only time this is mentioned. He's going to talk about it again here in verse 16 and onward, and then near the end of the chapter as well, that now that we have tasted of the love of God, now that we know a little bit about what love is, we have felt and experienced and received love, you got to go out and live it also. Love is not something that you just get to keep in your pocket like a good luck charm. Love is a tool. It is an implement. It is something that must be shared and used and fully utilized in order for you to really appreciate it. Let's keep reading here and see what he has to say then. If God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has beheld God at any time. And that's a point he's going to make later on at the end of the chapter, that if you can't love your brother who you have seen with your eyes, how can you make a claim that you can love God who you haven't seen? If I can't love the person standing right in front of me, then how can I make this bold claim that I love a God who I can't see with my eyes? Doesn't seem like a claim that I can back up. Nobody has beheld God at any time. So if you really want to say you're a loving person, you can't put that on an invisible God. Well, I'm very loving. I love God. I don't know if you can really define yourself as some quantitatively sort of loving person if all you love is the invisible God of this universe. Now, are we supposed to love the invisible God of this universe? For sure. And He must get all of our love, our first love. But how can you make a claim to be a loving person if you can't love the people standing right in front of you? No one has beheld God at any time in verse 12. If we love one another, God abides in us, and His love is perfected in us. By this we know that we abide in Him and He in us, because He has given us of His Spirit. Now, that's a whole other sermon on its own. That's Romans chapter 8. We've received the Spirit. Once we've been adopted as sons into the family of God, we receive the Spirit. And the Spirit, like Ephesians chapter 1 says, the Spirit is like a foretaste. It's a promissory note of the good things to come. And I really want to talk about it more, but read Ephesians 1 or Romans chapter 8 for a little bit more information. We've got to move on from that because that's a whole other sermon all by itself. Verse 14, and we have beheld and bear witness that the Father has sent the Son to be the Savior of the world. Now whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son, God abides in Him, and He abides in God. Verse 16, now we have come to know and have believed the love which God has for us. I like that you have to believe love. Like love isn't just some kind of like misty sort of concept out there, right? Love is not just kind of like wafting through your life in some intangible way. You have to believe love. There's got to be something concrete about that. I believe in the love of God. I trust the love of God. Now that goes back to chapter 2 of 1 John. It says in verse 28 of 1 John 2, now little children, abide in Him. Same language there, isn't it? How do we know He's abiding in us? Are we abiding in Him? Little children, abide in Him so that when He appears, we may have confidence and not shrink away from Him in shame at His coming. If I don't believe in the love of God, when He comes to judge the world, I am going to shrink away in shame. If I don't trust and believe in His love, if there's not meat there, substance there, then when I hear those angels blaring their trumpets, I'm going to go, ah! Because I don't believe in the love that was promised to me. God told me that He loves me. And He told me that while I was still helpless, He saved me. I have to believe in His love. In verse 16, we've come to know Him and have believed the love which God has for us. God is love. And the one who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. By this, love is perfected with us, that we may have confidence in the day of judgment. Because as He is, so also are we in this world. There is no fear in love. If you love God and you know He loves you, you are not afraid of Him. Now, of course, that brings up the question of, Ryan, when I was baptized, I was very young. I understood the gospel, but I certainly wasn't as mature as I am now. When I first got baptized, I'll tell you what, part of the reason why I got baptized was because I was scared of hell. I didn't want to go to hell. Does that mean that my baptism was somehow invalid? I'll tell you what, I actually get that question a lot. That's one of the more common questions that people talk about with me is, when I was first baptized, I think I did it because I was scared of going to hell. But now I've matured and I want to be a Christian because I love God. Does that mean that maybe I was wrong at my baptism? Well, I'll put it this way. As an initial motivation, I don't think there's anything wrong with not wanting to go to hell. I think if you become a Christian because you are terrified of hell as an initial motivation, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I do think this passage in 1 John chapter 4 is challenging us on that. I think what is challenging us is, as you mature and as you grow, are you moving past the idea of fear as a primary motivator? Is it fear that's driving the engine of your faith? Or are you growing up, moving past fear, and learning that it is love? Love is a much more potent fuel. Love is a much more powerful motivator. Love has more substance to it, more meaning to it. Love also has more application. There's more you can do with love than you can with fear. Fear is limiting, okay? Fear is, I'm going to stay in my house. Fear is, I'm not going to leave my comfort zone. Fear is, I'm never going to go on an adventure. Fear is, I'm never going to expose myself. Fear is, I'm never going to say anything that get me in trouble. Fear is a very limited sort of thing. It has very limited application. Love is like one of those multi-tools. When you get your Leatherman out, right? Now, Leatherman's got everything. If you don't go through life with a Leatherman, you're missing out. Fear or love is a multi-tool that has a lot more application. And so I think when you read this verse, you need to see that love has to be where you're moving toward, right? It has to be kind of the end result as you're maturing as a Christian. Perfect love, he says, casts out fear. Because fear involves punishment. And the one who fears is not perfected. He's not perfected in love. He's not grown up to that point yet. So no, I don't think you have to get rebaptized when you get older and you realize I've kind of matured and changed and I'm not so scared of hell anymore. But maybe I was 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 50 years ago. I think maybe at that time when you're 13, 14, 15 years old, I think it's okay to be scared of hell. But have you moved past that? Are you moving towards something that's going to perfect you in love? So as we bring our passage to a close here in verses 19 and onward, here's the practical application. We love because He first loved us. There's no credit to me there. The credit all goes to God. If He had not loved me first, what hope would I have? If He had not reached out His hand to me, I'd still be drowning in sin. If someone says, well, I love God, but hates his own brother, he's a liar. Call him out for it. He's a liar. I like how blunt John is sometimes. John is the sort of person, he grew up, he's a blue-collar fisherman. That's what he is. John is a blue-collar fisherman, and he'll say things rather uneloquently. If someone says he loves God, but he hates his brother, the dude's a liar. Plain and simple. There's no polite way of putting it. That dude is a liar. He's a liar. For the one who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot possibly love God whom he has not seen. You got to live it. And this commandment we have from Him. By the way, back in John chapter 13, we do have that commandment from Him. Near the end of that chapter, after Jesus has washed His disciples' feet, He's put His clothes back on, He said, look what I've done to you. You call me teacher and Lord, and so I am. I'm leaving you an example to follow, to serve each other. And near the end of that chapter, He says, I'm giving you a commandment. And this commandment is that you need to love one another. And the world will know that you're my disciples because of the love that you have for one another. So this commandment we have from Him, that the one who loves God should love his brother also. And I suppose it's at this point that you go back and read 1 Corinthians 13, right? Because 1 John 4 is all about where did love come from? What's the high-level concept here? Why do we love? How do we understand love? How do we define love? And then 1 Corinthians 13 picks it up and says, now let me show you what that love looks like on a daily basis. Where it believes all things, and it bears all things, and it's patient, and it endures. And it never rejoices in unrighteousness, it rejoices in the truth. Let me show you what love looks like. Let me show you what love looks like. Will you show me what love looks like? The person sitting next to you in this auditorium, will you show that person what love looks like? Our brothers and sisters who are struggling spiritually, who have sins in their lives, who are a little lukewarm in their faith, will you show love to that person? The enemy in your life who hates you because of your faith, who maligns the faith, your enemies, will you show them what love looks like? Will you be defined as a loving person, not as the world defines it, but as God does? Let us strive to be love as God is love.